Story recapped here. Today I'm going to explain a drama, horror, and mystery film called Ouija, Origin of Evil. Spoilers ahead, watch out, and take care. It's a regular day in the Zanders household where widowed mother Alice conducts a reading for Mr. Browning, who's recently lost his wife, Mary. However, his daughter, Jenny, is very dubious about Alice's profession and throws suspicious glances at her, even telling her father not to pay the woman. Alice lights 3 candles in front of them and says that the Brownings may ask 3 questions. Jenny mockingly asks why only 3 are allowed, but Alice ignores her and lays out the rules. She then asks Mary to blow out the candles if the answer to their question is a no, but to let the candle burn if the answer is a yes. As Mr. Browning asks his question, the candle seems to be responding to his queries. So Jenny confronts Alice about what's going on. However, she gets cut off when the table suddenly moves but quips that it's probably just Alice shaking the table with her knee. Then, Jenny fails to speak when she sees a moving silhouette of a woman through the curtains. With tears in his eyes, Mr. Browning asks about a current situation with Jenny, that she and her boyfriend are requesting a lot of money for investment. Unfortunately, the last candle gets blown out with this inquiry, indicating that Mr. Browning shouldn't give in to his daughter's request. Jenny finds this infuriating and exclaims that Alice is a scam, resulting in the silhouette jumping towards them from behind the curtains. The 3 scramble off their seats in surprise, and the cabinet shakes as things become chaotic. Alice then escorts her client outside and apologizes for what happened, and when Mr. Browning is about to pay her, she refuses the money. As Alice goes back inside, she angrily calls out to one of her daughters, Paulina, and scolds her for almost giving Mr. Browning a heart attack. She tells Paulina that her only job is to stand behind the curtains. But Paulina defends herself by saying that Jenny deserved the scare because she was trying to take her father's money. However, Alice reminds her that they're only there to comfort the grieving, not judge them. Meanwhile, she opens the cabinet top to show a hidden compartment with her youngest daughter inside, Doris, who's responsible for shaking the cabinet. Alice also checks the table and her shoe, revealing that she's been controlling the candles all along. As Alice gets Doris ready for bed, she watches her daughter pray to her deceased father, Roger, instead of praying to God. Doris wonders why her mother doesn't pray anymore, but Alice assures her that she does and reminds her to pray to God. Doris then asks her mother why her father won't talk to them. So Alice tells her just because they can't hear him, it doesn't mean he isn't there. After that, Alice says goodnight to Paulina without entering her room, so she fails to notice how her eldest daughter is sneaking out through the window to go to the house of her friend, Ellie. Then when Paulina arrives at her friend's place, she gladly accepts the alcohol that Ellie offers. Meanwhile, Alice takes a look at all of their overdue bills. Back at Ellie's house, Paulina and her friends decide to play with a Ouija board and go through the rules one by one. Never play alone, never play in a graveyard, and always say goodbye. They then start by asking whether or not there's a spirit inside the room with them, and the planchette moves to yes. The other girl, Betty, immediately freaks out, but Paulina finds the situation amusing because she doesn't believe in it at all. So their guy friend, Mikey, uses this opportunity to ask Paulina to be his homecoming date, and the planchette once again moves towards yes. Unfortunately, their game is cut short when Ellie's mother angrily bursts into the room and calls for everyone's parents. Moments later, a disappointed Alice comes to pick up Paulina. Paulina immediately apologizes to her mother, but Alice is unhappy that she's been drinking. However, she understands that things have been hard for her daughter since Roger's passing and asks her to help her with everything. So Paulina says she'll try. Then, before going home, Paulina suggests adding a Ouija board to their seance act. The next morning, Alice goes out to get some props for her seances and remembers Paulina's suggestion for a Ouija board, so she buys one as well. Later that day, Alice witnesses how some boys bully Doris at school, telling her that her mother is a witch. Luckily, Father Tom, the school priest, comes to her aid and tells the boys off, which Alice greatly appreciates. She also thanks him for the support he's been giving Doris, and Father Tom assures her that it's no trouble at all. At home, Alice remodels the Ouija board so that she'd be able to manipulate the planchette using the magnet strapped to her knee under the table. Then practices with her new prop and pretends to talk to a spirit. And as she does, Doris, who's currently in the bedroom with her sister, answers her mother's question. She also says her name is Marcus, making Paulina wonder who her sister is talking to. Before heading to bed that night, Alice uses the Ouija board and asks if her husband is there, but when he doesn't respond, she walks off dejectedly. However, the planchette suddenly moves as soon as she's gone, moving towards no. Meanwhile, Doris notices that and starts talking to the spirit herself, even looking through the planchette to speak to her spirit friend. Concurrently, Paulina wakes up from her sleep when someone suddenly yanks her blanket away. She thinks Doris is just messing with her, but as she goes back to sleep, she fails to notice the mysterious entity standing in her doorway. When Alice picks Doris up from school the next day, Father Tom confronts her about Doris's homework and asks whether she's been helping her with it. Alice feels ashamed that she hasn't been helping her and asks whether Doris is falling behind, but the priest says it's quite the opposite. Doris's homework is in cursive, which they haven't learned yet, but the girl insists it's her new friend who's helped her. Then in the car, Paulina tells Alice she didn't help her sister either, so Doris tells them she simply let her friend use her hand. At home, they see a foreclosure notice which worries them. As they all feel forlorn about the news, Doris takes out the Ouija board to tell her father about the bad news. Meanwhile, Paulina talks to her mother outside about the house and mentions how Doris still doesn't fully understand the situation due to her young age. However, when Doris joins the two outside, she hands them a bag full of cash. When asked where she got the money, Doris leads them to the basement and points to a concealed hole in the wall, saying that it's from the house's former residents. Then when Alice asks how Doris knew about it, the girl says her father has told her. Skeptical, Alice and Paulina join Doris in using the Ouija board to find out if the girl is telling the truth. Sure enough, the Ouija answers all of their questions correctly. Doris says her father doesn't need her to communicate with them, so she removes her hand from the board, proving that the planchette moves on its own. Alice and Paulina feel scared as they back away from the table, and as Paulina refuses to believe what's happening, she points out ways that Doris could have manipulated the board. However, Alice is convinced that they can finally stop being frauds, adding that they now have a way to talk to Roger. Then before she goes to bed, Paulina sees someone move in the living room through the planchette. At school, Father Tom speaks with Paulina and shows concern regarding Doris, who has been absent for 4 days without a single notice. So because of that, Paulina explains that Doris has started working alongside their mother. At home, aside from having the planchette move on its own, Doris is also able to channel the spirit's voice. However, after doing so, she immediately feels a stinging pain at the back of her neck. Then when the painkillers that Paulina gives her don't help, Doris tries to ask her father about the painful feeling but gets no response. Determined, she goes in front of a mirror with the planchette to check what's going on and sees a black spirit holding the back of her neck. Unfortunately, as soon as Doris screams, the spirit starts possessing her through her mouth and leaves her unconscious on the floor. Meanwhile, that night, Paulina gets a nightmare about her mouth getting sewn shut. The next day at school, Doris's personality has visibly changed as she keeps glaring at nothing. Then she stares back at the bullies when they try to hit her with a slingshot, and the spirit starts controlling the boy's hand and makes him hit himself. That night, Alice meets up with Father Tom to talk about the girls, and the priest says that being involved in the spirit world is dangerous. However, Alice is convinced that she's doing a good thing for those that are grieving, and even offers to help him reach his deceased wife. Meanwhile, Paulina invites Mikey over and warns Doris not to snitch on her. Paulina then tells Mikey that Alice will get mad if she catches them. So they share a kiss before Mikey says they're like Romeo and Juliet and leaves. However, as Mikey's about to depart, Doris stops him and offers to tell him something cool. She proceeds to give a detailed, gruesome explanation of how it feels like to be strangled to death. And after that, she bids him goodnight and calls him Romeo, before going back to watch television. Before heading to bed, Paulina sees Doris writing something without looking at the paper and immediately feels weirded out. However, she decides to ignore it and goes to her room, where she finds her doll's mouth sewn shut. Paulina is angry because the doll was a gift from their father, so she confronts Doris and blames her for it. However, Doris says it was their father who did it to stop the voices. Unfortunately, Paulina doesn't believe her and continues shouting until she alerts Alice, who quickly checks what's going on. Paulina thinks that her mother is stupid for ignoring what's happening to Doris and tries to convince her that something is wrong with her sister. But Alice only gets mad that Paulina is raising her voice at her. The next morning, Doris refuses to go to school and even throws a tantrum about how she'd rather stay home and talk to her friends. Then Alice asks Paulina to get her sister's stuff from her room. And as she does, she finds the sheets of paper that Doris was working on the previous night and quickly gets worried. Paulina then shows Father Tom the papers and asks whether he knows someone who could translate them since they're written in Polish. And the priest says he'll ask one of the school nuns. Then that afternoon, Father Tom immediately drives to the Zanders to take up the offer of talking to his deceased wife. Like Alice, Father Tom asks specific questions about his wife and gets correct answers. The spirit claiming to be the priest's wife also tells him he shouldn't hide behind his priesthood and that she wants him to be happy. And once again, Doris channels the spirit's voice. After the reading, Father Tom asks to speak privately with Alice, so Paulina invites them to talk in her room. Curious, Doris says she wants to come with them, but the priest makes sure she just stays downstairs. Then, Paulina leads Father Tom inside Doris's room, where he explains how Doris didn't get the correct answers to his questions. However, he clarifies that she was able to read what was in his mind. So when he asked about his wife's middle name and thought about his mother's middle name instead, it was what the spirit answered. Because of that, Alice immediately feels defensive that Father Tom thinks Doris is a fraud. However, Father Tom says he believes that Doris is talking to spirits, but adds that she might be talking to the wrong ones. Meanwhile, a possessed Doris listens to their conversation and gets disturbed by Mikey's arrival. Doris then invites him down to the basement to show the hidden treasure within the walls. And although he's initially hesitant, Mikey ends up following the girl. She lets Mikey look for pieces of jewelry in the hole where she's found their money. But instead of finding gems and trinkets, Mikey discovers a doctor's bag. He also eventually finds a skull, and as Mikey sits there in horror, Doris proceeds to possess him. Back upstairs, Father Tom pulls out the paper that Paulina has given him, which are revealed to be journal entries of a man named Marcus. In the letters, Marcus talked about how his family was rounded up by the Germans during the invasion of Poland. He also mentioned the devil's doctor, who was infamous for the experiments he'd conduct on the patients. He was then rescued by the Allies and came to America, where he ended up in a mental hospital. Unfortunately, the devil's doctor was also working there under a different name, and he took Marcus to his house to continue his experiments on him and the other patients in the basement. As Father Tom continues telling Marcus's story, Alice and Paulina finally learn that they currently live in the devil's doctor's house. As if that isn't enough, Father Tom tells that Marcus talked about his death and being in the dark with the others. However, Alice still thinks that Doris is talking to Roger, but Paulina points out that the spirits know everything about them because they've been watching and listening to their family right from the start. Scared and worried, they go down to confront Doris, but they get terrified when Mikey's body drops from the ceiling with a noose around his neck. Paulina quickly breaks down as she sees him, so Alice tries to calm her down and reminds her they need to find Doris. They then head to the basement with the intention of burning the Ouija board in the furnace, only to be distracted when the light suddenly goes out. They also discover the bones of the unfortunate souls within the walls, and Paulina says they've unknowingly played the Ouija board on a graveyard. As they try to burn the Ouija board in the furnace in the hopes that it'll solve their problems, they hear Doris calling out from the vents. So Father Tom volunteers to bring her out and asks the two to stay behind. Then as he crawls through the vents, he finds the room where the cruel experiments were conducted. He also finds Doris there and starts reciting a prayer. But the possessed girl says that God cannot see that house because if he did, all the tormented souls wouldn't be there anymore. Feeling sorry, Father Tom offers to help the spirit, but it's already beyond saving and attacks him instead. Moments later, Father Tom comes back possessed and chases Alice and Paulina with a knife in hand. The priest catches Alice while Paulina manages to reach the front door, which unfortunately is locked. Father Tom then gains a moment of clarity and makes a last-ditch effort to help them by closing the door on himself, but is eventually thrown down the stairs and killed by Doris. Meanwhile, Alice and Paulina see the Ouija board back on the table. Alice is then pushed back by an invisible force, while Paulina is grabbed by Mikey's hanging body and thrown to the stairs. To make things worse, Doris crawls on the wall and chases her sister to possess her, but Alice begs the spirit inside Doris to take her instead. Unfortunately, the vengeful soul says that they'll take all of them. Then Alice gets knocked out by Doris and dragged down to the basement, where she wakes up chained to a stone bed. On the other hand, an unconscious Paulina is saved by her father's spirit, who carries her back to bed. She then witnesses the moment she's accused Doris of sewing her doll's mouth shut, realizing she's telling the truth upon seeing her father behind her. Because of that, Paulina gets an idea of how to stop the spirits. Paulina returns to the basement and grabs a sewing thread and needle for her plan, upsetting the spirit and making Doris scream. However, Paulina perseveres despite the spirits holding her off and proceeds to sew Doris's mouth. Due to that, Doris's spirit eventually leaves her body and joins her father's. Meanwhile, Alice finally frees herself and checks on her daughters, only to see that Doris is already dead. Paulina feels guilty about what's happened, but she says she did what she had to do to stop the voices. Then, as Paulina sits beside her grieving mother, Alice realizes too late that she's also been possessed and gets stabbed by her. Paulina can only cry when she comes back to her senses and sees what she's done. But Alice doesn't blame her for it and welcomes death as she joins Roger and Doris. Later on, Paulina gets admitted to a mental institution because of the tragedy that's befallen her family. The doctors tries to get the answers out of Paulina about what happened in the house, but she's often unresponsive. However, the doctor still pleads for Paulina's cooperation because they're yet to find her sister's missing body. In her room, Paulina tears off a part of her carpeted flooring and bites her finger, recreating a Ouija board using her blood. She also uses someone's eyeglasses as a planchette held between her fingers and calls for Doris' spirit. Meanwhile, as the doctor walks by Paulina's room, it is shown that Doris is inside with her. The doctor takes a second glance to see Paulina staring back at him, unaware of Doris' spirit running on the ceiling towards them. In the post-credits scene, a much older Paulina remains in the mental hospital and is visited by someone who claims to be her niece.
Subscribe to watch more videos like this. Turn on notifications. And leave a like, it really helps the channel out. Thank you for watching.